Hey, Steve. Yeah, I don't know if anyone's been productive. So let me do a couple things here. So you're seeing me through YouTube, right? Oh, there we go. Man, I'm messing stuff up today. Anyway, let me just do one last thing. I might just play a little bit until some folks show up. Some other folks. Just bump this. Hey, Oscar. Play some guitar. How's the balance, guys? Yes, Oscar, this is my real beard. Actually, it needs to get trimmed though. So, this lesson is basically about the video lesson that we put up this week. Oscar is 100% correct. It is the Fish scale and the Grateful Dead scale, Mixolydian, which is part of the reason why in the video lesson I kind of characterize it as being one of the more boring scales to play. It's fun to play over, but it's also kind of plain in sound. There's not a whole lot of inherent tension in it, so you can sit on it and it sounds kind of static. You can go for a long time. So if you're gonna noodle at Madison Square Garden with the rest of Fish, you can do it for a long time. You're not being forced into resolutions and stuff. All right. So if you didn't do the if you guys didn't do the lesson before, we've got where are my overlays here? Is it this guy? That's that one. That's the wrong one. That's that one. That's the wrong one. Hey, Howie. Have I lost my PDF? Ta-da! There it is. So let's put this guy over here to the side. All right. So this is the handout from this week. There's the caveat on here. If you haven't really done any of the cage system lessons, it probably wouldn't hurt, but we try and do this in a way where anybody, hey Ken, can work their way through it. Now at the beginning of this, whoops, and in the beginning of the lesson, I talk about the difference between major and minor, or major and Mixolydian scales, and what it comes down to is that the Mixolydian scale, it's the fifth mode of a major scale. And in practical terms, what you're dealing with is the idea that it's a major scale with the seventh note lowered. So if we're playing here in A, which is what the lesson's primarily going to be in, We got root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And instead of major 7, we have minor 7. Now, one of the reasons why this is helpful is because if you've already got vocabulary in the major scale, you can utilize it. You can just lower the one note, right? We want to get into this idea where you have a major tonality, you have minor tonality, dominant, whatever the basic or core tonality is, and then you can just alter any of the ideas to fit the other tonalities. Right, so that's kind of one of the things that we're dealing with here. But it's important to me that you understand that these are pretty close in terms of what the scales are. Now, in the handout, I kind of I cheated a little bit. This could have been like a 15-page handout, and there was one mistake, as Mr. Blank and the Blanks emailed me or messaged me about right after the video came out. If you're keeping score at home, there is a 4 missing right on the G pattern, the top one. It goes root, 2, 3, and then there's a blank where the 4 should be. I'll fix that at some point, but not today. Okay, so when we deal with major scales, the fact that you have the major 7, that, you know, in other areas of harmony, we call that the leading tone, right? And that's called the leading tone because it actually provides us with this sense of resolution when we go from the 5 chord to the 1. Without that note, if we're playing it this way, honestly, all we're getting is this scale that kind of sits there. And in some ways, it's kind of a cool sound. Other ways, I like to dress it up, especially when I'm playing over different kinds of feels. All right, so one of the first things that you can do is work through, you know, if you've done the Caged and Beyond video lesson series, we have the system where we go through and we build the scales on the paper. You could do that with this. Just remember that the half steps, instead of being between the 3rd and 4th notes and the 7th and 8th notes, are between 3 and 4 and 6 and 7. I try and get my students to write this stuff out as much as possible, because if you get this stuff in one part of your mind or your intelligence, for lack of a better word, it becomes easier to utilize it someplace else. If you're just memorizing all these on the instrument as a bunch of, you know, basically rote patterns or movements, they don't really mean a whole lot. Whereas if we're actually doing this in such a way where you're intellectually understanding it and you can picture it or visualize it in your mind's eye, then putting it on the actual instrument itself is not so hard. And it also gets you closer to your oral imagination, or we could also call it your mind's ear. Could be internalizing these sounds too. When I have students practice this stuff, I have them call out the scale degrees as they play the scale. And part of the reason for this is just to keep them honest in terms of playing these things accurately. Root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, minor 7, root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, minor 7, root. All right, and if you've got a phrase, right, so right there, it's off the top of my head, root, 3, 5, root, root, 6, 5, root, root, 6, 5, root, right? I know what that is if I want to turn it into a minor. If I want to make it a minor phrase, right, that's actually a Dorian sound, right, because I just lowered the 3rd. I know what the difference is, and I know where that note is on the fretboard, and I can kind of hear it in my head. If I want to make it, let's make it not sound very good. Let's do this as a natural minor. All right, kind of loses all of its jump bluesy kind of vibe to it. But it's there, and it's a way of taking any phrase or any idea that you have and moving it someplace else. But it's really only possible if you're aware of what these notes are relative to the root, you know, and what these notes are relative to whatever the scale or tonality is. So the biggest thing with Mixolydian is you want to remember it's got a minor 7th. It's basically a major scale with a minor 7. All right, and then as you're doing this, when you practice it and you're calling the scale degree out, your ear's hearing it, you're basically starting the ear training part of this. Right? You're engaging your brain a couple different ways, orally or, you know, through the ears, right? Orally by counting it out, right? So you're having to think about what it is, right? And then the physical part of actually putting your fingers on there. All right? I discover if I work on things in that way, it becomes a lot easier for me to retain them. If I just sit and I try and memorize a pattern, it doesn't really work quite so well. All right. Now, if I've got this idea, one last thing about that. Say I've got, all right, so back to our kind of jump blues roots here. Root, I'm sliding into 3 from a half step below, which is a common thing for blues, especially jump blues or jazz. And then 5, 6, root, right? If I want to, I could use that formula anywhere. Root, flat 3, 3, 5, 6, root, like root, flat 3, 3, 5, 6, root. Right. So at a certain point, the fretboard just becomes one big pattern. We're not really worried about learning a lick and then only knowing it physically in one place anymore. You can break it down into what it actually is relative to your root or your key, and then you can put it anywhere on the fretboard. That takes a long time. I don't expect any of my students to get that very quickly, but it happens over time as you work on stuff in this fashion. Now, if I put the backing track back on, part of me being able to get this sound is being aware of the fact that I've got an arpeggio that's almost like the framework for the tonality. And in the cage system lessons, we made a point of learning the scale and then learning the root 3/5 or the major triad within that scale. All right, and that becomes easy to kind of hang your solos on because those scale tones give you places to either play a phrase and then resolve it, or it tells you where the notes are that aren't in there, which actually give you the tension to resolve. So it actually gives you something to do with it. So if we just play the chord tones, even my phrase before, I needed the 6th in there. There's the 7th. Right, those notes all kind of feel stacked, but if I play that 4 really wants to resolve. Especially down, if anything's a half step away from a chord tone, it really wants to move towards that chord tone. Okay. So you learn the scale, you learn the arpeggio, in this case the 7-note dominant chord arpeggio, which you see in the second neck here. Let's see if I can, here. My camera's backwards. Root, 3, 5, minor 7, root, and then you've got the other notes which help you make the phrases. Alright. All you want to do really when you practice this, even if you just made a loop, if you took a looper and you just played like a real simple 1-chord vamp, just play each note and see what it feels like against the chord. Root, it's the root, it resolves. The 2, it's got some tension, it's got some energy and it wants to move. Either down or, there's the 3. Resolves a little of the pressure. There's the 4, tension. Maybe we'll move it down and resolve the pressure, or move it up to the 5. That 6, it's funny because the 6 can kind of go either way, but for right now, feel what happens when I go from 6 to 5. There's a feeling of resolution. If I go 6 to minor 7, that one's kind of weird, because it is a chord tone, it's important. It doesn't feel super resolved because we're really still close to the root. So that's one thing to think about. You're playing chord tones or you're playing the opposite of chord tones. Experiment with that. Let your ears tell you what it is that you're trying to get out of it. So I need to tune this real quick, I feel like. So what happens when you take a guitar out of a case this week after not restringing it for 2 months? And the weather's finally changing here. Okay, so I'm going to stop there just for a second, and I'm going to see if you guys have any questions. Oops. Any questions? Or any problems? Or any... Oops. Go back there. All right, I guess we're good. Hopefully this is making sense here. I've got the if you can see my desktop there, it's basically I've got the video monitor and I've got all my overlay things, and then there's the messages, and I'm hoping that they're all coming to me from YouTube. So if I don't answer your question, let me know. Hey, Rich. Okay, good. All right. So in the PDF, the next thing is we talk about just the next pattern of this scale. All right. I'm not going to go through the whole thing other than to just kind of play through it one time. Right? And I can take any of that stuff we just talked about and do it with this pattern, and do it with the next pattern up the fretboard, and so on. As you learn all of these, yeah, as a younger guitar player, I always had the spots on the fretboard I was real familiar with. Like, you know, I could always solo if I was an A right here, because I had that A minor pentatonic really good, and then I could play like the A minor scale there, whatever, right? But then like I might get here, which I'm really comfortable with now, but you know, I couldn't play anything there unless it was a B.B. King lick, right? You end up having these spots that are sweet spots on the fretboard for most of us, where we know them really well, and then there's these gaps where there's nothing, and then there's another place where we might be good, and then there's like where it repeats an octave higher. I always liken it to, you know, during the age of exploration, you'd have these maps, you know, you know, in the 14th, 15th century, these guys just started making big maps, and you'd have really detailed parts of the world where they knew it really well. So, you know, maybe Northern Europe would have a lot of detail, and you'd see the coastline would be really big. And then you get farther away, and especially you get down to like the coast of Africa, and there'd be like the outline of the coast of Africa, and then it'd be blank. It might say terra incognito, like, you know, we don't know what it is, or there be monsters, right? And the guitar fretboard's a lot like that. We've got the places that we're comfortable in because we've lived there. And then we've got the other parts of the fretboard, which maybe we don't know. That's terra incognito for most of us. And a large part of what I try and teach is to fill in the entire fretboard. So anywhere you're at, you're somewhat comfortable with this. Now, I get into weirdnesses. You know, I've got a degree in jazz performance. I don't play a lot of jazz. There are times where if I have to play in the key of G flat, doesn't matter what it is, just G flat major, G flat minor, I get really tied up in that key. And you think, well, it's the same as G, which you play in all the time because you're a guitar player. But it's rare enough for me to think in G flat that, you know, that's terra incognito for me sometimes. And if I've got to play a gig where there's a song where I've got to play in that key, I either think of F sharp, which is the same thing, or I really have to kind of work it out if I really have to consider it a G flat. And there is a difference. There really is. So the idea here is not just having a couple places that you're real familiar with, but we're trying to get the whole fretboard. We learn it in the cage system at first in these digestible chunks. You know, basically, you know, each of those cage boxes is kind of a nice silo or vertical arrangement of the notes in the scale, but it's hard to use all of those musically. So what happens is we have to break down that cage system. This is kind of the most common complaint people have about the cage system, is that, you know, you just get trapped in these boxes and you can't make music that way either. The reality is we use the cage system as a stepping stone to learn the rest of the fretboard. And this is one of the first things that I would do. If you look at the bottom of the PDF here, there, you know, basically I took both patterns and I overlaid them, right? Now, you could do all of this with 3-note per string scales. That's a totally valid way of doing it. I could play Mixolydian starting on any note and just make sure that every string has 3 notes in it, and that would force me to actually have kind of a diagonal scale pattern, right? No matter where I started, you know, I could do that anywhere, you know, and it would give me something useful. And I think about that way sometimes. But one of the reasons why in this lesson I didn't do that, and there's the duplication of notes in places, is because I want you to start seeing more of the complete fretboard. The 3-note per string thing can be kind of its own trap, you know, because we love, you know, it's, you know, shredder guys love it because it's easy to kind of move around in like that way. So it's got its own thing. And you discover that the guitar fretboard, just like with music theory, you know, it's all about how you organize things. It's all how you get this stuff packaged in a way that makes sense for you. So when I teach this stuff or when I'm learning it, I'll take a look at the same thing a couple different ways. And at some point, either all of those things kind of melt together into one big understanding, or I just find one way that works better than the other ones. Right? So this becomes the problem. Some people just teach cage, some people just teach 3-note per string patterns. Some people just put a bunch of dots on the paper and say this is where the notes are, the RB monsters, and it doesn't necessarily work so good. So with this, you know, say I've got that phrase that, right, I know, or, right, because I know that there's the 3 right here and here. Right, I'm able to actually, off the same root, you know, it doesn't matter which of the 2 patterns I'm thinking about, I know exactly where those notes are. At a certain point, this just kind of melts into chicken soup. And, you know, it's like one of those analogies, like if you take a carrot and you take a piece of chicken and some celery and some water, and you just have them individually, they have distinctive tastes. They're just individual things. But you put them together in a pot, you boil them for a while, and for better or worse, it tastes something like a chicken soup sort of product, right? You know, all together, when they've all had time to break down together over time, you know, you apply heat over time, and then it becomes this food item. Right? And that's kind of what the guitar fretboard ends up being like. You learn the major scales, you get good at that to a certain extent. I tell my students, never expect to learn anything perfectly before you move on. You know, most of the time, if you get it like 70-80% good, move on to something else. You'll come back and pick up the rest later on, or your understanding of the next concept will backfill it for you, right? Especially with this stuff, because we're treating all of these scales as sounds, and we're also making sure that we know what those notes are in the scale, so you see how things move around. You know, we talked about, and I've got a lesson where I take a mode, like you know, A major pentatonic, and we just add a couple notes. Actually, it's a pentatonic scale, all right? And then I say, you know what, if you put the 4th note and the 7th note of the major scale in there, you got a major scale. If you lower the 7th, you got the Mixolydian scale. If you play the major 7 and you raise the 4th, you have a Lydian scale. If you lower the 7th and raise the 4th, you have a Lydian Dominant scale. You know, and it becomes easy to think about these things around that sort of structure. You know, you've got a basic framework, whether it's the chord tones, the pentatonic makes a good basic structure to hang these ideas on. It all interrelates to a certain point where it becomes easy to switch ideas in and out. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second and ask if you guys have any questions. Okay, so as far as we go here, these are these 2 patterns. One of the things I love doing, and it doesn't matter what if it's major or Mixolydian, I have this like this phrase. It's like my secret sauce phrase, and it could be something like that. Yeah, and what it is basically is we're dealing with the major triad. In this case, there's the 3, the root, and the 5. Which you see in the bottom phrase there. There's a 4, 3. So it's basically the open D shape up here. There, and then the same thing an octave lower, 3, root, and 5. Right? It's a great way to pass through a major sound. And having the 4th added, right, just basically gets away from it being all chord tones. If you're just dealing with the triad, charge, you know, it's like playing a bugle, right? There's nothing interesting about it beyond maybe those 4 notes. But if you add something, even if it's just a 4th, it's almost like its own scale sound, right? And when I'm playing over like this backing track, right, that's kind of a cool sound. I'm not even playing the dominant notes yet. Right, it's kind of southern rock, you know, kind of Allman Brothers-y. If you like Pink Floyd, you know, you've got David Gilmour uses stuff like that, like Uncomfortably Numb. For me, though, I've got this basic pattern, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it's a good way to transition between those two patterns, right? So I've got 3, and I might go 3, 4, 3, root 5. Except for when I play the kind of that part. Right, that's all that triad plus 4. Right, now if I want to, now let's add the minor 7th into the sound. So what I've done is I've broken this Mixolydian scale into a couple different smaller bites. You've got just the triad, you've got the triad with the 4th note, you've got the triad with the 4th note, or the 7th chord with the 4th note. Doing this just keeps you from just running up and down the scale endlessly. And that's the thing that I fight the most with my students, because honestly, if I give someone a scale pattern, we end up getting a lot of... Right? It doesn't go anywhere so much. So breaking it up and then we can kind of eventually get to that is cool. So Oscar brings up a really good thing. Like if you play blues, Mixolydian, you know, it's the mode that goes around the chord that we play in a blues the most, right? But honestly, it's not very bluesy. And this goes back to me saying that this is a boring mode. It's got none of the tension or grease that makes, you know, a blues sound. Like if I was to play over the same backing track, right? I'm playing just minor pentatonic. Right, that's a different sound, even though it's minor and I'm playing over a chord with the major 3rd. Right, I can get that bluesy sound out of the minor scale partially because I'm taking the minor 3rd and I'm cheating it towards the major 3rd. So there's the major 3rd. Right, that's not very bluesy. Right, so I can actually do that kind of bend deal and play my Mixolydian phrase. Or I can do what I was doing earlier where I approach the 3rd from a half step low. Right? So that's kind of the first thing, is actually breaking the 3rd into basically the minor 3rd approach tone in the 3rd. Either by playing them together or, you know, or getting kind of greasier. Just taking that minor 3rd and bending it up, even just a quarter step. If you bend it up a half step, where it's in tune, it starts to sound more like country music. It's not quite as bluesy. All right, so Richard, one of the things about this is if you started, like I've got below this video, I've got a bunch of, let me shut this off for a second. I've got a whole like series of videos. It actually starts you off basically at addition and subtraction, if you want to use the math metaphor, and then kind of works through there. So if you're feeling like this is a lot of numbers, and you're not drawing an immediate connection between what I'm talking about and then what you're seeing on the left side of the screen, you know, it's always good. You can always go back and check those lessons out. Okay, so here's the next thing, is that with this dominant sound, we're kind of getting into what I was going to cover in next week's video, which is cool. You can take any chord tone and approach it from a half step below. Right, so that's something that you can do also with this. This is kind of a terrible backing track to do this over, but it's the one we're using. So I can play any of the scales. Right. particularly bluesy, but it starts getting us there. Right. I can play anything a half step below and a scale tone above. So I could go 2 half step below the root and that guy, or do what we call an enclosure in jazz. Whoops. And that will also work over all of these chord tones. It works in major. You can also put in the minor 7 to make it Mixolydian, right? These are just different ways of embellishing the core sound of this. All right. For blues also, you can take an approach that like a jazz player might, where you take 2 of the notes and you connect them with a chromatic passing tone. Right, so I've got the minor 7 here, and this is the root. Right, and as long as you're not spending any particular amount of time on the note in between, you can play any note you want to. All right, let me find a better backing track for this. Actually, I'll just take one of the major ones here because I can get away with this. Where's the A major one? All right, so this is one of the other backing track collections we have on the channel. And it's kind of almost like a Memphis-y kind of deal. Hopefully you can hear this. So we're still in a, hey Modern, say hey Randy. All right, so I can take the minor 7 to the root. Right, I can approach the 3rd note from a half step below. Or do an enclosure, so 4, half step below the 3rd, 3rd, and then we're still on the bottom neck here, and then root, chromatic tone to the 3rd. Right, so right, that gives me a little bit of slinky, greasy chromaticness, which also kind of helps. So I can take any 2 notes, whether it's the root to the minor 7, I can go 3 to the 5, so I can even go right. It's not like right there. It's actually my favorite Charlie Parker bluesy kind of lick there. But I'm going root, half step below the 3rd, into the 3rd. All right, and then I'm going 4, sharp 4, 5. So I'm walking chromatically from 1 chord tone, the 3rd, to the 5th. Down to the 7, the minor 7 there, right? What happens is that you can connect anything. You can play any note. Really, I can play any note over this I want to. It just depends on how I resolve it. No note is wrong until you stop playing, right? So I've got, okay, I'll start simple. So I got the major triad within, or the root 3/5 within the Mixolydian mode. Right, I can play the dominant 7 arpeggio. Right, I can play the root, the triad +4. Right, I can do it also with the 7. Right, that's a sound. Right, I can start doing some of the half-step embellishments here. Right, all I'm doing is whenever I get a chord tone, I might go down a half step and back. I can do the full enclosure where it's the scale tone above and the half step below. Right, I can start connecting the notes with chromatic passing tones. This one's 5, chromatic tone down to the 4, and then half step below the 3, and then from root down to the minor 7. All right, all of that stuff, if I'm really where I play longer extended phrases, they're all hung on the framework of that dominant chord arpeggio. And to a certain extent, you know, I'm aware of the Mixolydian mode, but the reality is that where I like to play it, and this is what next week's video lesson is really going to be about, is all these ways that you can embellish that sound. And you can play anything. I mean, honestly, I could play a chromatic scale over this and get away with it. Is backing track loud enough for you guys? Hopefully you can hear it. Okay. Enclosures, I'll get to in just a second. So, alright, so chromatic scale always works if you end on a scale tone. Alright, I can play, here's a minor pentatonic scale. I can play a half step too high. Now if I do this, that sounds terrible. Right? But say I'm playing minor pentatonic. Right? What I just did there is I'm playing that minor pentatonic, go up a half step, continue to lick, and then come back down so I resolve it. So I'm basically in the harmony, out of the harmony by a half step, so I'm really out of it. Alright, and then I return into the harmony by going back to the scale. So alright, so I can play totally outside, and as long as I return to something that's comfortable, as long as there's an actual resolution to this, I can play anything. It doesn't matter. I can just play triads from other chords. Alright, I love doing this. So there's A major. I can play, I can take a diminished arpeggio, so root, minor, third, flat, 5, and 6, and just use each one of those as a root for a major triad. And as long as I resolve back to my A7 chord, it doesn't matter that I played all of these weird outside ideas. Right, so right there, you can play major triads, a tritonal part. A, E flat, A, E flat, A. Right, and that sound it's cool because it's pretty out there, but it always returns. So you're in, out, in, right? This leads you to the idea that, you know, if you think you're playing a wrong note, just move it up a half step. Move it up a fret or move it down a fret. You're always just one fret away from playing something that will cause everything else to make sense. All right. When I'm dealing with, if I'm playing something I'm not really familiar with or comfortable with, and I'm playing a phrase and it doesn't feel like it's really working out, you know, I'll find a note that'll kind of end me back in the key. And what happens is that when you play that last note, suddenly everything that comes before it is logical. Right, so I can play stuff and it won't sound logical at all. So I'm playing garbage, right? Right, but if I'm I just took this major triad and moved it up chromatically, so it's just creating tension, and then I release that tension into a chord tone. So just A major, B flat major, B major, C major, C sharp, and then just ended on the A because I knew the root was there, right? But if I went, well, there's no resolution there. Well, what I played didn't make sense, but alright. I can play whatever I want between point A and point B, and as long as point B is in the key, all of the stuff in there sounds like I meant to do it. It reminds me of Pee Wee Herman and Pee Wee's Big Adventure, where he falls off his bike, then jumps up and goes, I meant to do that. And this is harmonically Pee Wee Herman. Okay, so enclosures are basically, to go back to Blank's, to Howie's question there, is where we take any of the chord tones and we surround it. And traditionally, that surrounding is done in a way that makes sense to the harmony. Now you can play anything a half step below, and as long as you're coming into the half step, it doesn't sound like you're out of key really. It's harder to do. Yeah, if you do it from a half step below, it starts sounding a little bit more exotic, and maybe that's something that you want, and that's where we get like Phrygian and Phrygian dominant sounds and stuff. But for the purposes of the kind of playing that we're doing, a half step below always works good. The other part of it is that if you do a scale tone above, so I can play the second down to the root, I can play the 4 down to the 3, the 6 down to the 5, even the root to the 7, right? Basically what's happening is you're taking a non-chord tone and you're resolving it or relaxing it into the chord tone. Right, so if we bring back the backing track, I just feel like it's just not loud enough. Oh, or actually, that's because I'm looking for volume in the wrong place. Sorry, guys. Aha. At some point, I will learn how to use this software. All right, see ya. All right, it relaxes. It relaxes. It relaxes. It relaxes. Or. Right. You feel everything resolve. At a certain point, everything that we talk about is about creating tension and resolving it. And how you resolve it depends on how comfortable you want the listener. I mean, if you really want to make them uncomfortable and stay uncomfortable, then don't resolve anything. That's completely valid if you're playing some really angry, aggressive stuff. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. There are no wrong notes, but your resolutions kind of determine what the listener hears your intentions as being, I guess is maybe the way to look at it. Right? So all of this stuff that we're doing here, we're creating tension and resolving it. So we're taking the two different approaches, that half step below, right? And we're taking the scale tone above, and we're enclosing or surrounding that chord tone. Bebop players will use this sort of thing a lot. It helps you kind of make longer lines out of arpeggios. Right. I really like. Sometimes I really like that flat 5, right? That one actually has a little bit more flavor than just needing to resolve, and that's also like if you're in Lydian, that's the sharp 4. If you're in Lydian Dominant, which is the Mixolydian scale with the sharp 4, that note works. Right. That's the Simpsons sound, right? Is it? Right. A lot of your being able to utilize this stuff is also relating it to sounds that you're familiar with. Yeah, Django is awesome at that stuff. Right. The thing with Django is because he's a gypsy jazz musician and he's coming from this more folk-based approach before he got to jazz. You know, he's dealing with a lot of stuff that's more chord tone in nature, and the way that he embellishes chord tones, even if it's like, he's doing our like the kind of vibratos that he might play, or he'll play the same note on 2 different strings to get different timbres. Right, all of that stuff. That's the extraness that actually makes this stuff musical, and it gives you your own personal sound, right? And that's why studying how different players play, like physically play, not just learning the stuff out of tab, but maybe doing a little research, watch some videos if it's available, trying to figure the stuff out with the like Django is a great example because he only had like 2.5 working. He had these 2 fingers, and then these 2 were like melted together. So he'd play all these really incredible, really quick ideas and phrases, and if you actually sit down and learn it with his phrasing, suddenly you have a completely different way of looking at the fretboard than if you just sit down and work it out by ear using your own fingerings. And you can learn how he gets those sounds that way. You can develop your own ideas because it takes you off in other directions. It's all process. Everything is process, and if you come up with different ways to process what you're doing, or different processes to learn this stuff or to perform it, then you're always kind of reinventing or enriching what you do. Right? some guys, B.B. King, did he really reinvent himself after, like, the early 60s? No, not really. I mean, he played different kinds of music, but the way he made music on his instrument was pretty well, figured out. But he was pretty refined then compared to what he was before. He went through a process, and if you listen to early B.B. King versus Live at the Regal, it's pretty different, And how he got there is we don't know what his process was, whether it was just he listened to different people or he tried to make his guitar sound more like how he sang or how he heard music. But there's an example of someone, you can hear the evolution in his body of work. And then later on, he's still kind of playing the same ideas. He just has a little different guitar tone, and he's trying different styles of music and whatnot. So anyway, okay, so that was a little bit more than we needed on enclosures. Do you guys have any other questions? Or any so one of the things which will come in next week, the rest of the PDF here is literally about what we were just talking about. So I'm going to get rid of the PDF at this point. You guys can print it out and look at it. One thing that's kind of cool to play over this sound also, instead of just playing the scales, what we call a triad pair. Let me arrange this so I can see more of the guitar and less of my shorts. My least favorite band in the world, Steely Dan. Not really my least favorite, but I'm not a big Steely Dan fan. One of their tunes, that tune, I don't know if it's Larry Carlton or whichever guy was playing the solo on it. He does this thing, and it always struck me. Right, where he's getting this sound that's honestly, it's Mixolydian, but it's not just playing up and down the scale. What he's doing is he's just taking two triads. Right, he's taking, kind of like what we were talking about before, he's taking the root 3 and 5, but then also you're taking off of the minor 7th. So it'd be like 7, 2, and 4. Or in this case, if we're in A, it's A major and G major, right? So over this, if I wanted to play that sound, oops. All right, and that's one of those things. Triad pairs in all kinds of different ways. I mean, literally, my A and E flat was a triad pair. But it's, once again, it's just about reorganizing the notes in the scale, and that's one of those ones that's kind of a pure or a clean Mixolydian sound to me, because there's no chromaticism, there's no weirdness or outside notes. But I always really like that sound. The Jan Hammer scale. I'm not entirely certain. I probably have heard it. I don't really reference anything by that, so I don't know. Is it something you can explain to me real quick, Oscar? If Oscar adds to that. Last week's lesson was about the minor pentatonic, and one of the things that I liked about that lesson was this idea, and it's kind of similar to how we're talking about the Mixolydian mode, where I'm just taking chunks of it and moving it around the fretboard. All right, so over, even if I go back to our backing track for this week, the misnamed funky A7 backing track jam, our Mixolydian. Alright, I've got all this Mixolydian stuff, but I can also take last week's lesson over this. Alright, so those, basically I divided the minor pentatonic up into cells. I'll post a link to that lesson here also. But what's nice is that that application also works here, and it's another place where if you're getting tired of Mixolydian, that gets us into kind of the greasier or edgier sound, because it's like, you know, trying to stick a square peg into a round hole. It mostly works here, but the edges don't fit. But then we can always resolve it back to the Mixolydian scale. In circles. So what I just played was basically me taking a whole lot of ideas, whether it was Mixolydian, whether it was the stuff that we talked about here in the lesson, whether it was stuff from last week's lesson, which also fit over this, right? And it gives me the ability to play over longer stretches of time and still keep it interesting. And that's kind of the other thing, is that because there's not very much tension in that basic Mixolydian mode, having all of this other stuff, it allows me to actually keep introducing things and keep making it interesting and kind of stringing along the interest so that it never really ends. Ooh, hello. My hand says hello. Autofocus is not being my friend today. I'm sure it'll settle in just a second. So, all right. Does this stuff make sense for you guys? That is not focusing. That is less than awesome. Oh, there we go. All right. So that's about what I have. I mean, honestly, what this all breaks down to is the idea that, you know, you kind of have to have a palette, and each one of these scales is a palette. When I was really active on the Harmony Central guitar forum years and years ago, none of us have really been active there in a decade. In the lesson loft, you know, they would argue over modes and how to use modes and what modes were. The gear page was like this too. And the thing is, hey Oscar, if you send it to me, maybe I'll share it in another one of these. I made the joke that modes are kind of like the Vietnam War of music theory for guitar players. You know, you just get bogged down in it and no one really gets anywhere. And the reality is that you can't look at each one of these modes as like the end-all be-all of anything. It's not a complete solution. It's a way of understanding a sound. And then as you're working to understand that sound, you've got these other things on your palette that you can introduce into them. I love the Mixolydian thing. I wonder if I can find somebody's funky thing. Let me find a funky jam track to take this out on. Funky. So we'll do a nice E-funk backing track. Let's see what comes up here. This one, it's E minor, E. All right. That is very less than funky, but so if I'm going to play over this, let's get rid of the unfocused camera here. So minor pentatonic. And then if I want to, I can add the sixth in there. Now, I don't know if this is it. It's an E7 chord, right? So I can play Mixolydian sound. I'm just playing over one chord, but because I'm actually spending some time bringing in all those different sounds over that groove, I can do a lot. And I kind of crammed a lot of stuff in there. Usually I'd leave a little bit more space and I wouldn't introduce stuff quite so quickly. But at the end of the day, if I had to play over an E7 funk jam, I could probably keep it interesting for more than 4 bars for a little while longer, right? And this goes back to my, we're just building or enhancing your palette when it comes to improvisation. Now, the Mixolydian lesson is good for a lot of things. Your understanding music theory, your understanding of the fretboard. At the core of it, I think most of you guys are probably here because you want to be able to understand how to improvise better, right? And so a lot of this lesson wasn't really just about Mixolydian scale, because we had that in the pre-recorded video lesson that's linked below. What a lot of this is what else can we do to make this practical? So next week's lesson is going to be a lot of the stuff that we talked about here, but I'll actually have it written out. I might have a sample solo that you guys can work from tab or something like that. If you guys dig these, a couple things. One of them, please, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and please hit like. That stuff helps. Believe it or not, I'm trying to build a kind of a new thing here. So anything interaction like that is helpful. If you like it and you want to share it with your various social media places or forums, whatever, please do that too. It's all appreciated. Also, if you have questions, feel free to send them to me through Facebook or YouTube message or whatever. Actually, Oscar just messaged me his Jan Hammer scale. But I can't do everything, and it may take me a while to get to something, but it helps having ideas about what you guys are interested in or need help with, for me to build videos and to do lessons like this that are actually interesting to you that you want to come back and check out. So please, by all means, let me know what you think. Give me some feedback, give me some ideas, let me know what you need help on. A lot of these lessons the last couple months on the channel I've been driven by the fact that I teach at a guitar conservatory. It's like a high school, performing arts high school, and I've literally needed to build my curriculum for the kids since we're doing everything remote. So everything's a little rigidly set up in terms of structure, but now that we're doing these video lessons, I'm open to ideas if you guys have ideas or things that you think would actually be interesting. So real quick, I'll take a look at Oscar's scale here before I go. So if we're in A, yeah, I know. Yeah, basically that's my the dominant arpeggio with the 4th head. Cool. But once again, I don't think about it quite like that. Like, you say, hey, it's a penta Mixolydian scale thing. Now, instead of thinking about it the way I was thinking about it, now it's like, hey, I might think about this more like a scale, and it may affect me thinking about it differently than how I was thinking about it before when it was an arpeggio. So once again, it's all about how you package this stuff for your brain. All right, if you guys are, it's about 6. Freeway jam. Yeah. Hey, Jeff back. Yeah, all of this stuff, the best thing that you can do is when you recognize a sound is catalog it with something that you already know. When I was in music school, a lot of the ear training was like, hey, what's a perfect fifth? Star Wars, or you'd basically take something that the melody of really well and say, hey, that's this distance. for me, when it was like learning modes and stuff, it was kind of the same thing. You find a song that makes sense or a sound that makes sense, and you remember it easier. All right, so attaching these sounds to songs that you know is a really good idea. All right, the freeway jams go. Yes, so okay. Well, thank you guys very much for hanging out. I appreciate it, and I should see you guys next week. So typically Sunday, Monday, new video lessons are put on the channel. If there's a backing track, I usually try and get it out too. Those are a little bit more rare. I've been doing lunchtime guitar hangs too, less important, less structured. And then obviously Wednesday evening is this. So come on back. Thank you guys very much for hanging out, and I will talk to you all soon.